Welcome to Quest Xian or QX Church. You can find us online at qxchurch.org, and I am Pastor Scott Conway. Some fundamentals of a unique position for this ministry is our B.U.M.P, a biblical unique ministry proposition, which is the how-to, real answers. Explain it all. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. God-trusting, Bible-believing, saved by Jesus church. And that maybe it doesn't mean what they say is just to say that sometimes there's multiple possible meanings of things. And no one church in our position can claim to be 100% right 100% of the time, which includes us. One of the other topics we talk about is divorce, and we are a very divorce-affirming church. And as part of divorce, we talk about the deal, we talk about marriage, and we will be reviewing our Divorce is Okay 10-lesson set in less than an hour. So it's going to go really quick. It's just going to touch on a handful of highlights, just as a reminder. If you want the deep dive into the subject, go to the Divorce is Okay and Everyone Agrees section. And then our solution to that is the deal principle, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And in addition to the B.U.M.P, in addition to divorce, we are also very, I won't quite say sex positive, but we talk about sex, like sex is something to talk about. And that we are very male affirming. And so we have our principles of heroic masculinity, fundamentals are responsibility, initiative, inviting, power, and selflessness. And so those are kind of our 4 core things that kind of direct us in a direction. But one of the very legitimate questions we get asked sometimes in response to divorce and deal principle and some of our ways we deal with that is, well, how do I build a deal? What you talk about courting and pre-courting and post-courting, and so where do we even start? And so that's what this particular lesson is about. We will be bridging from divorce to deal. And in previous whole lesson arcs, we have done a very, very deep dive into the subject of divorce. And we have done a very deep dive into the deal principle as a principle. But in response to certain questions about, well, how do I court? Like, what's the subject matter of courting? How do you make a deal? How do you decide? How do you talk about it? Can you give me some guidance on that? That we will be bridging from talking about divorce and the deal principle as an abstraction to sharing the Yori 350 level program of the vow deal. But let's review the idea of divorce. When I say divorce is okay and everyone agrees, that if someone is a Christian, if someone is a Jew, if someone believes the Bible, they must necessarily accept the fact that under at least certain circumstances, divorce is okay. Because if divorce is never okay, we have a problem. God is divorced. Jeremiah 3:8. And I saw for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yes, God Almighty, the very God who says, I hate divorce, is divorced. And he's the initiating party of that divorce. So God may hate divorce in the same way almost everyone who has endured a totally failed marriage also hates divorce. It's hard, it's infuriating, and it hurts desperately. In the Divorce is Okay program, we dealt with Malachi 2:16. We dealt with Jeremiah 3:8. Unless you think this is just a one-verse wonder, we also got some support for there from Hosea 2:2 and Isaiah 51, like chapter 50, verse 1. And part of the reason, by the way, that's important is because if you hang your whole theology on a single verse, you better be really, really sure that verse only has one possible meaning, and that nobody else could reasonably interpret any other way without torturing the words. So Jeremiah 3:8, that reminds us that God is divorced, is also echoed in Hosea 2:2 and in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1. We also dealt with Genesis 2:24, chapter 2, verse 24, Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 from the Old Testament. And then we also dealt with Matthew 5:31 to 32, Matthew 19, 4 through 10, Mark 10, 2 through 20, and Luke 16, 18, and a lot of related New Testament verses and passages that deal with the same principle, but with slightly different issues than specifically divorce. Now, we do have several traditional views. One of the traditional Christian views on divorce is that there's just no divorce or remarriage, period. Another view is there's no divorce or remarriage except for adultery. Another is there's no divorce or remarriage except for adultery or abandonment by a non-believer. And those are just a handful of traditional Christian views. And almost any church you go to will adhere to some version of one of those three. Now, a common quote whenever I teach on the subject, which I find amazing, is, well, you realize the Bible says God hates divorce. It's like, oh, well, being a seminary educated pastor, I had no idea. Of course, I know the Bible says that. However, what's also true is that most people who will just casually cite that verse with that interpretation also don't know Jeremiah 3:8. They don't know Hosea 2:2. They don't know Isaiah 50, chapter 1, or chapter 50, verse 1. That they know that there is a verse, Malachi 2:16 for the address, where God says something that's commonly interpreted as God hates divorce, specifically for I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel. And that's true. He does hate it. Whatever this thing is he's talking about, he hates it. But he hates divorce like a divorced person hates divorce. He's not declaring from that statement that it is always wrong, because if it is always wrong, that means our God is guilty. And the fact that our God is the initiating party in a divorce tells you there are at least some circumstances upon which divorce must be okay. Because if it is not, we can't be worshiping a sinful God, obviously. So this God hates divorce concept, that comes from Malachi 2:16. And divorce is sometimes translated as God hates putting away, or the Hebrew word anglicized to shalak. Malachi 2:16, for I hate shalak, says the Lord, the God of Israel, and him who covers his garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. So whatever the shalak thing is, there's a connection between the shalak, this divorce, separation, putting away. There's some idea of violence. There's your spirits involved. Treachery is involved. And a bunch of things in here you're not supposed to be doing. There's all kind of bundled together in this thing that God hates, this thing that God despises. And so we need to be aware that that's not as clean maybe as we might like that to be, because the divorced God hates this divorce thing and related issues of violence and a treacherous spirit. And so there's a lot of things in there that are worthy of unpacking. And for those who study Hebrew, and I will readily admit, I am not one of those, that when you do the translation of this passage, the experts in Hebrew will tell you this is a very difficult passage to really translate well into English. For I hate divorce, or I hate putting away, is pretty good, but it's more intricate and deeper and complex than that. And it's difficult to unpack well in English. And thus, if a sermon is going to hang their hat on this, you could literally spend a chunk of time unpacking just this, which in the divorce is okay, and everyone agrees a program. We did. We dove into this passage in depth in that series. Now, there's a statement of principle, another one that's very common, and this is related to something that Jesus talks about. It's a statement of principle, Genesis 2:24. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. In response to a divorce and marriage question, Jesus talked about this and says, therefore they are no longer one, or two, but they are one. And what God has joined together, let not man separate. And there's a principle here. This is the way it's supposed to work, that there's supposed to be this leaving and this cleaving and this being one flesh. There's supposed to be something going on here, and that's the way it's supposed to work. There's supposed to be a unity. There's supposed to be a harmony, that this coming together and this cleaving is supposed to create this new unit, not two individuals battling for power. It's like there's a running joke that says, that when a couple gets married, the two become one. The fighting begins when they try to figure out which one. But the reality of it is there's a him and there's a her. And when they come together, this new them should be a higher third alternative. It should be something more than either one of them could be without their partner. And at a more idiosyncratic level, something more than either one of them or different than either one of them could be with any other partner beyond the one to which they are married. So that's a statement of principle, Genesis 2:24. That's how that's supposed to work. The leaving, the cleaving, the becoming one flesh, the two become one. He doesn't stop being him. She doesn't stop being her, but together they become a them. They create this us. They create this we. They create this higher third thing that is more than either one of them. It's not the him plus her. It's this dynamism that happens, a synergy that happens that creates this whole new powerful joint entity that makes new things possible, not the least of which, of course, biologically is a bloodline. Then we have case law. Now, this is something that is often another unknown. So just as the people who very tritely will go and say, well, God hates divorce, and therefore never, ever, 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 don't know about Jeremiah 3:8, don't know about Hosea 2:2, don't know about Isaiah 51, that they just think God hates divorce, never any divorce. And some people say, well, the two have become one, and you're never allowed to get divorced. Also don't know about the case law passage, Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11. The concept of case law is that case law uses specific hypotheticals, although this one may also have been a real life example. And then it provides a solution to a set of facts. And then that solution serves as precedent for how to handle other situations that work under the same principles. Now, this Exodus 21 example is about a master who had married one of his own slave women. Now, in Hebrew law, if a woman had a right, a man also had a similar or parallel right. Under Hebrew law, if a slave had a right, then a free person also had the similar or the parallel right. And so if a slave woman has a right, that means a free woman has the same right. It means that a slave man has the same right. And it means a free man has the same right. And so by using a case law example of a slave woman, there's essentially extending this right to everybody. And here's how the verse reads. And if you haven't found Exodus 21 in your own Bible by this time, Exodus 21, 10 to 11. If he take another wife, as remember, you are allowed to have more than one wife. So if he take another wife, he's already married this woman who was his slave. So he had ownership rights that slavery worked differently than what we commonly think of chattel slavery in the modern age. Usually you became a slave as voluntarily to pay off a debt. There are a number of ways this could happen. And when your term was up, then you were allowed to leave or you were allowed to stay. And if you chose to stay, you had the option of staying because you thought that being a slave to this household is actually a better deal than I'm going to get out there. And so it was a choice that was made available to people. And it was a voluntary thing. But in this process, if she's a slave, that means that her rights are very, very limited. Among other things, like you can't quit until your term of service is over, and. And it says, if he take another wife, so this man who is married to the slave woman takes another wife, and her food and her clothing and her duty of marriage, and duty of marriage is kind of a euphemism for conjugal love, basically having sex with your wife, he shall not diminish. And if he does not do these three for her, then she shall go out a free woman without being paid for. So this is the case law one, is she has the fewest rights of anyone in the country, that rather than a man to a woman, a free to a slave, that she is at the lowest tier of who has rights, and she has this right, the right to leave as a free woman. That if she leaves, she's allowed to leave. She doesn't get restored to her status of slave. She is set free. And she doesn't have to have her freedom purchased. She just gets it. And how does she get that right? Is when he is not fulfilling the deal. Because the ancient marital vows in old Judea or old Israel was that the husband was required to provide a certain amount of food, a certain amount of clothing, and was required to be available, while he's in town, of course, because if he's traveling, he's gone, just like people today, and is required to be physically available to her for sex. And in her particular case, of course, in that time, physically available to her in her efforts to become a mother. And it doesn't say that if he stops doing it, it says if he diminishes. And that means if he adds a whole other wife, he is not even allowed to diminish what he gives her. He's not even allowed to give her less of this and less of that and do less of this other thing with her. Because if he just does less, she is allowed to leave because he is not fulfilling his marital vows. Or the language that we might use in our program we'll be discussing is he's not keeping the deal, that there was a deal and they got married and this was the deal. And if he breaks the deal by not fulfilling it at the same levels that he agreed to, or the same levels he was required to, and that's a related issue, she's allowed to leave. And he doesn't get compensated for that. He didn't say, well, but she was a very valuable servant and I should be paid. I mean, what's it going to cost to replace her? And doesn't matter. You didn't give her all the food, clothing, and duty of marriage to which she was due as your wife, and now she's allowed to leave. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 is a statute. Now, this is when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it comes to pass that he find no favor in his eyes because he has found a cause of indecency in her. Let him write her a certificate of divorce and give it to her and send her out of his house. And this goes into what the whole issue was with Matthew 19, when Jesus is speaking on divorce. That when he was approached and asked, like, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? One of the ways we commonly interpret this in English is there ever any reason good enough to get divorced? Like, is there anything that could happen? I mean, could there be, abuse? Could there be adultery? Could there be anything else? Whether she's murdered our children, is it okay? I mean, that's not what we're talking about here. What we were talking about is what was called the Hillelite, any cause divorce. And the any cause divorce was crafted out of this Deuteronomy 24:1 because a cause of indecency was split by the Hillelites. Was like, if she find no favor in his eyes because he has found a cause or found indecency in her. Now, meanwhile, a parallel school, the Shammaites, said, no, a cause of indecency. Indecency is the only cause. Basically, it's sexual infidelity. It's a violation at that level, which in a genealogically defined culture, there's not a lot more than calling into question one's lineage. And then he could file for a certificate of divorce. Well, this debate was going on. Now, ultimately, the Hillelites won the debate. But they won the debate because there were no more Shammaites to argue the debate by the end of the first century. And so Jesus was speaking on this issue. Now, however, when this is interpreted as he says that, well, he talks about the Genesis principle of the leaving and the cleaving and the being one flesh, and therefore neither are the two one, or neither are they two, but they are one, and let what God has joined together, let not man separate. Three common interpretations that there's no divorce period. And that's what Jesus is saying, that you're never allowed to divorce, no matter what the reason is. Number two is that there's no divorce except for adultery. And number three is that there's no remarriage except for adultery. Or, and this was our argument unpacked in great detail in the Divorces OK series, is that Jesus spoke to the Hillelite versus Shammite debate. And Jesus expressed the principle and the primacy of the relationship. And that Jesus was remaining silent on the issue of for-cause divorce because there were no arguments or issues to discuss. Neither the Hillelites nor the Shammaites were arguing whether or not the Exodus 21, 10 to 11 divorce was valid. They agreed on that they agreed that if a woman wanted to divorce a man, she only had the for-cause divorce available. And if he did not violate his vow, she had no power to divorce him. And that there was no argument that a man had the right, that if he wanted to divorce a woman and he had cause because she wasn't fulfilling her vows, that he had the power to also use a for-cause divorce. But thanks to the Hillelite courts, a man could use for-cause divorce. But with any cause divorce available, the men were using any cause. Now, part of that was because proving cause in a Shammite court was difficult. You had the classic Jewish legal requirement of two witnesses. And there's a historical account of a man had approached the Shammite court to petition for divorce, to divorce his wife for adultery. And his argument was that after from some travels, he had come home early and he had literally walked in on his wife and this man. And he had seen it with his own eyes. Well, she didn't admit to it. The other guy didn't admit to it. He was his only witness. And because he did not have a second witness to verify it, the Shammite court would not grant the divorce. And he was required to stay married to her and required to continue fulfilling her rights as a wife, and that she still had the right to all of the rights that a wife had. And there was nothing he could do about it because he was Shammite. He had to prove it in the Shammite court, which meant he needed a second witness that would testify to that fact, and he did not have one. So proving cause in the Shammite court had its challenges. But cause did not need to be proven in the Hillelite court because you could literally use any cause. Like, oh, well, look at that. She didn't have gray hair when we got married. She has wrinkles. She didn't have wrinkles before. And if you remember in the Fiddler on the Roof, if you ever seen that, and there was this discussion about, so even if the wife burns the toast, that is cause enough. And it's because for any cause, you literally just needed any cause. And it didn't matter how trivial it was. It didn't matter how unavoidable it was. If you could just name a cause, it's done. So in Matthew 19, 4-10, in Matthew 5, 31 and 32, in Mark 10, 2-12, in Luke 16, 18, the listening audience would have heard Jesus saying, no any cause divorce. And there would have been an automatic implied understanding that if you are going to divorce, you had better have grounds. And specifically, grounds related to the vows. That you have to show that they're not doing something that a spouse ought to do, or they are doing something that a spouse is not permitted to do. But if you had grounds, you are still allowed to divorce. So it would seem to go without saying that if you are actually divorced, that marriage is permissible. However, there are several broad schools of thought on this. One is that divorce is never permitted. And if divorce is never permitted, remarriage is never permitted either. Another school of thought is that divorce is never permitted and remarriage is permitted only if the spouse dies, that you are still bound by your marriage, that if you got married again, you would be a bigamist up until the time the spouse dies, because once the spouse dies, then you would be free anyway. And so one school of thought says divorce never permitted, remarriage never permitted, divorce never permitted, remarriage permitted only if your spouse dies. The third school of thought is that divorce is permitted under limited circumstances, commonly adultery, often including abandonment by a non-believer, and that under those circumstances or under death, remarriage would be permitted. And then the fourth is divorce is permitted for grounds, and remarriage is also permitted. And that is a really quick summary of the entire Divorce is Okay program. Now, remember, that one is a 10-lesson program. And I am not going to unpack in one lesson 10 lessons there, nor the 10 lessons of the deal principle, because our solution to this is simply the deal principle. Make a deal, keep a deal. Now, one of the advantages of having the deal related to the vows, as it was in Exodus, is everybody knows what the deal is. One of the problems that we have today is people get married and there's no clarity around what the deal is. And part of it today, especially in Western society, is the deal is very individual. And what that means is the deal that I want will be different than the deal somebody else wants, which then also means if we never talk about it, we actually don't know what the deal is. We don't know what we are agreeing to. Now, in broad strokes, sure, maybe. We know some big, obvious things. But we don't usually get divorced over nothing but big, obvious things. We don't usually have marital problems inside only over the big, obvious things. And even then, some of the obvious things aren't equally obvious to both sides. So for part of this, to deal with this, we have the courting concept. Now, courting, as we teach it, is seriously exploring potential marriage. So in pre-courting, courting, and post-courting. Pre-courting is answering the courting questions by yourself. If you pre-court totally single, you can pre-court alone in a relationship, which may mean you have a relationship, but you're not discussing these, you are exploring it for yourself. And you can even pre-court in a marriage where, as a husband, I can figure, okay, what is it that I'm looking for in this relationship? And then courting is when you do it as a couple moving into a relationship. Post-courting is courting while you're already married. And so you're talking about, okay, how are we going to structure? What is it you want? What is it I want? What's my ask? What's your ask? What's my offer? What's your offer? What are our deal breakers? Let's put this together. And very often, if you're having effective marital counseling for a dissolving relationship, one of the strategies that I have found to be very effective is just to start this exploration and to have both sides begin with their own pre-courting, and then we come together and we start having some conversation. As part of the courting process, you consider, what is your ask? What is the deal as you expect it? And then what's your offer? What is the deal you offer? What do you bring to the table? And then what are your deal breakers? What ends the deal for you? And then on each element, what is your definition? So if you want a particular thing, what do you mean by that? And then what are your rules? How do you know your definition is being met? And then use examples to clarify. Now, on some of this, like say, for instance, if I use a fundamental example, one of the things I want in a wife is I want faithfulness. I want her fidelity. And if she hears that and goes, oh, yeah, I won't have sex with anybody else. So no. For me, faithfulness is only nominally connected to whether or not you have sex with someone else. For me, faithfulness is how well do you keep the deal? And so if we're going to use marriage as the example, for me, a faithful wife will be loving, honoring, obedient, do plenty of having, plenty of holding, will seek the better and the better or worse, seek the health and sickness or health, seek the richer and richer and poorer, will make me her primary relationship, forsaking all others, will cleave to me, that we will work together to make it our way, and that this is the deal for as long as we both shall live, period. Well, that's very different than faithfulness and fidelity means don't have sex with somebody else. Now, she says, well, I also want someone who isn't going to cheat on me. Like, okay, well, and if I hear that and go, okay, yeah, I can just not have sex with somebody else. Says, well, no. I consider it cheating if you have lunch with another woman. And it's like, okay, so like even incidental to work. So like if me and another attorney are working on a project together, but the other attorney is a woman, and we meet in a public place and we have a public lunch, you consider that adulterous? And she says, well, yeah, of course. And to her, it could be obvious because if her very conservative church background was that you just don't spend time alone with a member of the opposite sex. I mean, Billy Graham, Zig Ziglar, if they're in an elevator by themselves ready to go up and a woman walks in and they're going to go up one floor in an elevator, in this elevator alone with a woman up one floor in another, they will get out. If they are flying in someplace to give a talk and the person who shows up in the car to pick them up is a woman, they will not get in the car. They will pay for a taxi before they will allow a woman to be the one to give them a ride. And for them, that level of never be alone with another woman is in part for their protection, because if you're never alone with a member of the opposite sex, you are completely immune from a false allegation that while you were alone, you said the this or you did the that or you touched the them. And so it is a protection, but it's by a lot of standards also very, very extreme. But if she grew up thinking, well, that's how a normal man of God responds, you're just never alone with a woman. And they're like, okay, well, then that is a different level of standard than I have ever opted to live by. And so that's part of why getting the definitions, what do you mean? And then what are your rules? How do you know that your definition is being met? Because sometimes we will use words and we will define them in ways that we think are clear. The other person does a thing and they think that they're being clear, but there's still a mismatch. In one of my more interesting relationships, the word obey became an issue because to me, 8 gates of submission, right? And so if I give an order, then I expect the order to be obeyed. But the 8 gates of submission apply. Is there good reason to delay obedience? Is there good reason to disobey? Is there good reason to belay? Is there good reason to countermand? Is there good reason to remove me from leadership temporarily? Is there good reason to remove me from leadership in part? Is there good reason to remove me from leadership permanently or in whole? And permanently and in whole might mean that I no longer get to be the leader. And in a relationship, that means we break up. And so all of these things where that is an automatic application for me. And if someone else takes, well, obedience means that even when you're being stupid and selfish and you're doing evil, nasty, demonic, satanic stuff, that I have no choice but just to say, yes, sir, and let you walk all over me. Well, we might use the same obey word, but what we mean by it is completely different. And so that's why we need to discuss definitions and we need to discuss rules about, well, what do we mean by that? And someone might say, oh, okay, so then all I have to do if I don't like what you say is I say, nope, 8 gates, not doing it. Well, one of my rules on the 8 gates is like, you are free to push back. And I will always honor the pushback unless I have a very serious reason to want to overcome the pushback. And so it's a lot like, something's passed and then it gets vetoed. And then the veto gets overridden and you get kind of this back and forth a bit. But I will very, very rarely do anything that would resemble an override. And it's because I trust my partner has a good reason. Well, what that also means is that at some point in the process, maybe immediately, maybe sometime later, to be able to figure out, why was that? So, well, I just didn't want to. Like, okay, is not wanting to a good enough reason for you on things like that? Because if it is, then it's like, well, I will submit to your authority and everything that I like. And I won't submit to your authority if I don't like it. Well, that's not really much in the way of submission. That's basically, I'll do what I do like and I won't do what I don't like. Which just means I give you the burden of making the decisions and I will accept or reject based upon how I feel about it. And so that's part of why you need to unpack these things. And so one of my rules is like, you are free to not submit to my leadership. I just need later on to understand why so that I can grasp the principles that are operating here so that we can develop a relationship that is most appropriate and most intimate for who I am and who you are. And that might be working our way toward marriage. That might be working our way to friendship. It might be keeping it professional. It might be keeping it more distant because we want the best relationship for us. Because if I love you, I want the best for you. If you love me, you want the best for me. And if greater intimacy for us is not best for us, if you reject my leadership, well, then we shouldn't be in a position where you are subject in any way to my leadership, and so on and so forth. And so when it comes to courting, it's to seriously explore potential marriage and to try to develop as between the two of you, what would our starting deal be? And if you're doing it post-courting, to unpack it like, okay, so from here, and this might be common after you've gone through a season of life and say now you're empty nesters, and realize that so much of your life has been focused on the children that you kind of lost track of each other, then you would do some post-court and say, well, what do we want our life to look like now? And then you post-court and you do the same thing. And on each element, what do you mean by it? And how will you know what you mean by it is being met? Now, say if you're trying to build a basic biblical marriage, well, it's leave, cleave, be one flesh. What do you mean by that? It's to not tear asunder. It's submission to leadership. It's an agape character. It's a relationship with God. It's a fruit of the Spirit. It's forgiveness, self-forgiveness, not judging, not condemning, not gossiping. And that's for both. Both husband and wife need to do their versions of leave, cleave, be one flesh. Both husband and wife need to take efforts to not tear this relationship asunder. Not just to not tear the marital status asunder, but not to tear the relationship asunder. But part of our point of view is that a divorce isn't what breaks the marriage. That the divorce is the legal recognition of the relationship long since torn asunder. So don't tear it asunder. And it's submission to leadership. Both the him and the her have leaders to submit to. It's an agape character. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's a relationship with God. It's the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, and the rest of that list too. It's forgiveness for one another and for others in general. It's self-forgiveness. It's not being judgmental. It's not being condemning. It's not gossiping. For the husband in particular, it's family team leadership. It's loving his wife. It's being respectable. It's being understanding. And it's being physically available to his wife. And I may note the reason that's be physically available to his wife rather than just be able to have sex with his wife is because physical availability will vary somewhat based upon the desires of the person. And so if her physical desires and her aches and cravings goes to cuddling and the foreplay and the making out, and that's part of that. And for wives, it's submission to the family leader, which includes the 8 gates. It's being lovable to make it easier for him to love. It's showing him respect, which the counterpart is he needs to be respectable to help her be able to be respectful. And for her, it's being understandable to help him be understanding. And of course, for her also to be physically available to him. Now, part of this whole bridge from divorce to deal is because in response to like, well, how do you craft a deal? Well, one of the ways you could craft a deal, if you're a Christian couple, you can go back through that biblical list of leave, cleave, be one flesh, not tear asunder, submission to leadership, agape character, relationship with God, fruit of the Spirit, forgiveness, self-forgiveness, not judging, not condemning, not gossiping. The husband's family team leadership, loving his wife, being respectable, being understanding, being physically available. The wife's role of submission to a family leader, being lovable, being respectable, being understandable, and being physically available to her husband. But something else you could do what has been done for thousands of years, and this is what that Exodus passage is based on, is that the starting deal is embodied in the vows. So the whole Exodus chapter 21 case line, Exodus 21, 10 to 11, was based on what were the vows. The vows were the starting deal. So this would be a great place to begin looking at it as a deal. Now, anyone who's been in pre-marriage counseling with me knows I will talk through these as part of our pre-marriage counseling, as part of building a deal as between husband and wife. So this is the express terms of the deal in the traditional vows, as we use them as love, honor, cherish, obey, have, hold, better or worse, sickness or health, rich or poor, forsaking all others, cleaving, and for as long as we both shall live. And for the next 10 weeks, we are going to be exploring this kind of in principle as the larger concepts, pieces at a time, as we kind of dig into if this is a starting deal. If when you say love, honor, cherish, that is part of a deal you are making, that they're actual vows. Now, a lot of people treat these vows as nothing more than ceremonial language that doesn't really have any meaning other than this is what you say, and then I do, and then you are, and then you go off and you do your honeymoon. But if you look at this as the building blocks of a deal, and that's what we're going to be addressing for the next 10 weeks. If this is the deal, is I will love you. For as long as we both shall live, I will love you. That's the deal. I will honor you. That's the deal. I will cherish you. That's the deal. I will obey you. That's the deal. There will be having. There will be holding. That's the deal. We will continue to be partners, not opponents, when things are better or things are worse. So we partner to make them better, even when they get worse. That we are partners, not opponents, in sickness or in health. And we will pursue health, but we will be partners even when there is sickness. In richer or poorer, we are partners, not opponents. Together we will pursue richer, but we are partners even when we are poorer. And the forsaking all others, that I will make you my primary relationship, period. And what does that mean when it comes to extended family? What does that mean when that comes to children? Primary, C to the partnership. And the cleaving, the leaving, and the cleaving, the being one flesh, the my way and the your way, and to make an our way out of that. And for that to be the deal for as long as we both shall live, which includes, what if we can't keep the whole deal? What if this falls apart? What if this ends? Well, I'm still alive, you're still alive. And there's chunks of this deal that can still apply. Can I love an ex? Can I honor an ex? Can I cherish an ex? Yes, yes, and yes. Now, should someone obey their ex? No. How about the having? Well, that's the sex. No. So some of these don't apply because the relationship status precludes it. But can there be some level of holding? Yeah. Should you still seek better? Yeah. Should you still seek richer? Yeah. Should you still seek health? Of course. Are you primary anymore? No, but should you be secondary? You should be secondary. That means in support of their new primary. And that you should keep your relationship in its proper place and not knocked away, but not elevated beyond what it ought to be. And this is especially important when you're working together as co-parents because you have an established relationship that must be preserved. And so can you keep the deal at whatever level is appropriate, not whatever level you feel like, for as long as you both shall live without regard to any possible changes in the marital status? Well, we're going to spend 10 weeks exploring love, honor, cherish, obey, have, hold, better or worse, sickness or health, richer or poorer, forsaking all others, cleaving, and for as long as we both shall live. So this has been Pastor Scott Conway from Divorce to Deal, from Quest Xian, the how-to, real answers, explain it all. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. God-trusting, Bible-believing, saved by Jesus church.